Hi, and welcome back to this Monday edition of Focal Point on AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. Great to have you in the conversation. Want to begin with a very, very sobering story. I mean, it's a story of barbarity and savagery that we used to think was reserved for biblical times and the Canaanites. Now, if you remember, one of the reasons that God removed the Canaanites from the land of Canaan is because they passed their sons and daughters through the fire. That's how it's described in the Old Testament. They passed their sons and daughters through the fire, and God says, I'm going to have to judge them for this savagery, this kind of superstition, this worship of this false god. I'm going to have to discipline them. I'm going to have to judge them. I'm going to have to remove them from the land. And that, by the way, is just a sobering reality, and I believe this principle still operates today, that nations, peoples can forfeit their right to govern sovereign control over land because of their superstition, because of their sexual immorality, and because of their savagery. Repeatedly down through history, this may even be part of the history of our continent here, where God has judged people who do have control of land, but he has judged them for indulging in superstition instead of the worship of the true and living God, judged them for their sexual promiscuity, and judged them for their savagery, and said, you have now forfeited your right to be in sovereign control of this land. And you think about what we are tolerating now as a nation, there is no reason why we are exempt from that principle. If it applied to the nations in the Joshua's time, the nations of Canaan, if it may be applied to nations who occupied this continent before us, it may apply just as well to us. Now, passing their sons and daughters through the fire, this was a reference to a god by the name of Molech or Moloch. This was a god who had a belly in which a fire burned, and he had arms extended out in front of him. And what the Canaanites would do to sacrifice their children to appease this god is they would take their babies, their infants, and they would roll them down the outstretched arms of the god Moloch until their children were burned literally inside the belly of this demon god. Now, I bring you this story, and we think of them as benighted. We think of them as barbaric. We think of them as savage. We're so much more advanced. We are so much more enlightened. We are a civilized people. We would never consider doing something so barbaric. Let me read this story from the London Telegraph. The bodies of thousands of aborted and miscarried babies were incinerated as clinical waste, with some even used to heat hospitals, an investigation has found. So they burned babies, aborted babies, to heat their hospitals. They call them medical waste, and they have a waste-to-energy program to heat these hospitals. So they take these babies, these aborted babies, they call them clinical or medical waste. They dump them in these incinerators so the heat can be used for the hospitals. Now I will submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, this is every bit as savage, every bit as barbaric as anything that the Canaanites did in their day. This is as savage and barbaric as sacrificing children to the demon god Molech. We are no more enlightened. We are no more advanced than they were. In fact, we are now regressing back into raw paganism. This is in the UK. It's probably happening here in the United States. We just don't know about it yet. 10 National Health Service trusts have admitted, 10 hospitals in the public health system there. Here's government health care for you. 10 government hospitals have admitted burning fetal remains alongside other rubbish. Notice that. That's how these aborted babies are characterized, as rubbish. This is the London Telegraph, other rubbish. What is included in rubbish? The fetal remains, the remains of these aborted babies, and it's put alongside other rubbish. So even the Telegraph is referring to these aborted babies as rubbish. While 2 others use the bodies in waste-to-energy plants which generate power for heat. At least 15,500 fetal remains were incinerated by 27 NHS trusts over the last 2 years alone, Channel 4's dispatches discovered. One of the leading hospitals, Addenbrooke's in Cambridge, incinerated 797 babies below 3 weeks gestation at their own waste-to-energy plant. The mothers were told the remains had been cremated. Another waste-to-energy facility at Ipswich Hospital, operated by a private contractor, incinerated 1,101 fetal remains between 2011 and 2013. So barbarity and savagery, almost of an unimagined level. And again, it's a reminder we are either going to move upward toward the light or downward into the a moral abyss, and that's where we're headed. If we reject the light of God, the light of Christianity, the light of the Word of God, this is where we're headed. We're not headed into some kind of glorious land of enlightenment and illumination and sophisticated intellectualism. Because these are very intellectual, sophisticated people that are doing this. These are some of the most highly educated, highly trained people in the UK doing this. And yet they are brutal, barbaric savages because they have turned their back on the light of God's Word. Now, here's some good news in all of this business. Remember, we talked about Kermit Gosnell. He's the abortionist in Philadelphia. He's in prison now, thank God. And he is the abortionist who would deliver babies late term. I mean, almost at full gestation. When they were born, they're outside the womb. They are full United States citizens. He would use a pair of scissors to snip the spinal cords. This is just internal decapitation. He literally was decapitating these babies. Their heads were held onto their bodies only by the flap of skin and muscle and stuff like that. But they internally had been decapitated. And that's how he killed them. And he's now in prison for doing that. Well, what happened to his house of horrors? This is what it was referred to as a house of horrors, and rightly so. Here's some piece of good news. Here's our winnable war moment for the day. From Newsmax.com, the Delaware abortion clinic owned and operated by convicted murderer Kermit Gosnell will reopen as an emergency food pantry and support center for low-income families. The building in Wilmington, Delaware, was purchased last year by Lutheran Community Services to be used for its new headquarters. Executive director said it's going to be a place of hope and life. And that's good news. So Kermit Gosnell rotting in prison with life sentence, his facility now to be used as a place of life and hope. Now, I think I'm going to save this for the bottom of the hour. I've got a column. Let me get into that because I got a column today on this very, very important Supreme Court case that's going to be heard tomorrow. Oral arguments going to be heard tomorrow. I'll talk about that more at the bottom of the hour. Critical case. We're actually going to take some time on this program to pray for the Supreme Court justices. But, one of the things that we're constantly told is, hey, you people, you pro-life people, you conservatives, you right-wingers, you evangelicals, you're anti-science. You're Neanderthal Cro-Magnons. You just emerged from some cave somewhere where you're scribbling pictures on the walls. You're anti-science. Well, I want to submit to you that it is liberals and progressives, ladies and gentlemen, who are anti-science. We are pro-science. We believe our public policy ought to be guided and grounded in the best possible biological and scientific science. That's why we reject the concept that people can be born homosexuals, because there's no evidence for that. Now, by the way, I probably should have given you a little bit of a warning before I started talking about what happened in the Gosnell deal, and my apology if I didn't give you enough warning to protect tender ears from that, because I know that that's very graphic information. And what happened in these hospitals in the UK is likewise very graphic. But let me ask this question. What's going to turn on this case tomorrow at the Supreme Court is the issue of when a woman is pregnant. When does human life begin? Now, this becomes significant because the Obama administration is arguing that the pills that Hobby Lobby is protesting do not actually cause an abortion. This is from CNS News, Terrence Jeffrey. The U.S. Justice Department is telling the Supreme Court that killing a human embryo by preventing the embryo from implanting in his or her mother's uterus is not an abortion. And thus, drugs that kill embryos this way are not abortion-inducing drugs. So this is the official position of the Obama administration, that you can have an egg that has been fertilized by a seed, a sperm and an egg come together, you get an embryo, and that, in our judgment, is a human being at its earliest stage of development. It makes its way down the fallopian tube, and then it implants in the uterine wall. It implants in the wall of the uterus of the woman who is now pregnant, and that when that embryo implants, then the baby begins to grow inside the mother's womb. Now, the Obama administration wants us to believe that a woman's not pregnant until that embryo implants in the wall, the uterine wall. So they say, look, this is just contraceptive. If it kills a fertilized embryo, this is not an abortion. This is just contraception. It is simply preventing pregnancy. It's not terminating a pregnancy. It's preventing pregnancy, even though it is killing a fertilized embryo. Now, it's interesting that the Obama administration, in their filings before the court, they admitted that among the mandated drugs and devices under Obamacare, some indeed did prevent human fertilized eggs, that is, human embryos, from implanting in their mother's womb. So they admit that some of these drugs will keep a fertilized embryo from implanting in the uterine wall. This is Solicitor General Donald Verrilli. 4 of the 20 approved methods, 2 types of intrauterine devices, IUDs, and the emergency contraceptives commonly known as Plan B and Ella, can function by preventing the implantation of a fertilized egg. Verrilli added this. This is the government speaking. Both the government and the medical amici supporting the government concede that at least some of the contraceptive methods to which plaintiffs object have the potential to prevent uterine implantation. Now, if you go to Princeton University, their website, they've got a number of medical dictionaries you can explore there, embryology texts, and there's research papers from a federal commission, and all of them, medical dictionaries, embryology texts, this federal commission, define fertilization as fertilization, not implantation, but fertilization as the beginning of a new human life with the formation of an embryo. So science tells us life begins at the moment of fertilization. We're pro-science, they're anti.